back to this. So anybody have any questions before we start on the stuff today? Great. Okay. Good enough. Who do we have? Ma'am, last name? Present. Okay. Wanted to make sure. Cool. All right. Just as a reminder, actually, let me check my calendar here. Oops. The papers are due at the end of the month, or first paper, rather. So you guys still have like 3 weeks from Wednesday, but just as a reminder, those of you that are in here physically, if you could bring them in, that'd be great. If you have to email it to me, that's fine too. Just make sure you send it to the correct email. And for all my online folks, obviously send them via email, and then I will sift through them for the next week. Okay. Let's see. What else do we have going on here? Okay. All right. So we ended here with like women's roles in the colonies and how the patriarchal order, while it was meant to keep things in line, didn't usually work out the way it was meant to. And we had this here, which, as I mentioned, we'll be seeing similar versions of this going forward. All right. So the next section is about the economy, which there was a lot going on. I mean, again, this was the 17th century, so there was a lot of changes in North America. So after the 1700, or after about 1700, the population was growing. For example, we have some numbers here. 1700, the population in New England was about 250,000. By 1725, it had doubled to 500,000, and then by 1800, it was at 2.5 million. So it jumped really quickly at the end, or towards the end of the 1700s. Now, this was more than just people having kids and the kids not dying immediately. This was also lots of immigration coming in from Europe, as well as, of course, the slave labor brought over from Africa. But because the land that the English colonists technically had access to was beginning to be limited, unless you were already there and had land and had a business, it was very difficult to come over and get land and make a business. You know, the whole like, oh yeah, you can come to America with nothing in your pocket and end up becoming a millionaire. That very rarely happened. And even those who did have land still had things to deal with. Oftentimes they would wear the soil out, which is something we'll get into in later chapters in even more detail. Of course, the natives don't want them there. And as the English settlers continue to push outwards, they begin running into the borders of French and Spanish territories. So obviously the French and Spanish don't want them there. So in the Middle Atlantic, so again, excuse me, this is like New York and a little south of that, people started moving to cities to try to find their fortune, or at least make enough money to survive, because again, if you don't have land, you really can't make any money. Most of the time, most people made money by farming, and if you don't have land, you can't farm. Obviously, though, as more people moved from the countryside to the cities became crowded, and the jobs there began to dwindle as well. So obviously, we've discussed tobacco and its importance in the economy, but needless to say, you could only benefit from the tobacco market if you had land to grow tobacco. So even if you had land, but it wasn't enough, and by enough I mean like more than 100 acres, if you had a single bad harvest, that was it. You were bankrupt. Because most farmers would like take loans from banks and use that to buy a bunch of seed for the spring, and then plant it all during the spring, grow it over the course of the summer, and then in the fall harvest it. And then they would use the money that they made from the harvest to hopefully pay back as much of the loan as they could, have some left over for seed for the next year, and then whatever little bit of extra they had, they would sell it to try to make a little bit of money. If that crop fails, that's it. Their whole system is gone. Needless to say, the bank is going to require something in compensation, so they're going to take the land. And yeah, you're now a landless laborer. And the people who did have a lot of land tended to run the government, businesses, trade, and regional politics, which we'll see, especially more so in the South. So the people who had the money, who had the means to survive even in harsh situations, were also the ones like running the economy and running the government and making laws that benefited them. Yeah, because, that's how things tend to go. Again, here we have population density. This is 1775, so, right before everything went down. Most folks, again, up here in the mid-Atlantic to New England, and you have a little bit more, spread out here. Down here in the South, we only really have people around Savannah and Charleston, and then, a little bit further north here. But then once you get further out, it's just really, really sparse. The table here is like 2 to 15 people per square mile in these pink regions. So, yeah, not a lot of folks once you get further out. That said, though, the population was exploding. In particular, obviously, the white settlers. Now, this is just the Chesapeake colonies. They also, of course, had slaves, and then the other line here, the Native Americans, not going so well. So, along with the English, we had, of course, Irish and Scottish immigrants coming over, Germans and Swedes, and, of course, African slaves forced across the Atlantic. So we had more than just English in the English colonies. So with the population exploding, many immigrants were pushing west to try to find, land for themselves, which, of course, as I mentioned in the previous slide, ran into Native Americans who did not want them there, and other European settlers who also didn't want them there. Now, this wasn't always like immediate conflict. A lot of the settlers would work with the natives to, agree to only use a certain part of the land, and the rest of it was for the natives. But it really depended on the individual. But the line between where the colonists could come in and settle and what was left to the natives was never really, shall we say, put down in black and white, no real maps drawn. So as more and more immigrants begin to flood west, this equilibrium falls apart. Scots-Irish settlers heading westward due to poor harvest quickly overwhelmed this. In particular, 1718, William Penn died, which made things even worse because, as we mentioned before, William Penn had some pretty fair dealings with the natives. But once he was gone and his sons and advisors were the ones left to take over, they weren't able to keep things as together as William Penn was. And then, of course, as I mentioned, with all the settlers coming in, they just started taking land without any consideration of what had been agreed to be left to the natives, which, of course, caused a great deal of conflict. But again, we'll get more into that in the next slide. So here we have, again, more of the ethnic dispositions of the regions. You even have some groups of Jews there in Charleston and Savannah. Really in the larger cities is where the Jewish immigrants ended up. Then, of course, Germans, Scots-Irish, Scottish, English, Welsh, Dutch, and then, of course, large African populations due to the need for slavery. Well, I say need. There's another one just with a bit more color to it. Is that? No, it's not quite the same one. And then here in North Carolina specifically, you can see the various groups, lots of English, then with African slave populations, French Huguenots, surprisingly enough, here, and then as you push further west, it's mostly Scots and Scots-Irish, and the Germans as well. They were the buffer zone between the English and the natives, oftentimes. So as I mentioned, this expansion led to conflict, because of course. However, it wasn't just the English settlers heading west and running into natives and other Europeans, but oftentimes these settlers who had already been there chafed under the pressure brought by new immigrants coming in, because there's been this idea in America since before we were even America that any new immigrants coming in were both lazy and also taking your jobs. I don't know. Now, granted, this early prejudice was probably due to the English hating the Scots-Irish anyway, because they've been at some degree of conflict for the last several hundred years. Which, the English just look down on everybody. So, going back to Pennsylvania real quick, there was this walking purchase where a claim of land within Pennsylvania beyond what had originally been agreed to by William Penn and the natives was claimed, and supposedly these documents were found that had William Penn and the natives agreeing to it. The documents were forged because, of course, they were. It was called the walking purchase because back then, when you decided, how much land you were going to use, it was how much surveyors could walk off over the course of however long. In this case, it was a day and a half. And I'll show you that on the map here in a minute. And then, of course, new immigrants coming in, which brought different religious groups, which you've kind of mentioned towards the beginning of the chapter. And, I mean, I say different brought religious diversity, but it's like they were all Christian. They were just different types of Christian. Well, okay, there were also the Jews, but they tended to be small and in the cities. What we're seeing here is like different types of Christianity, different versions of usually Protestantism. Occasionally you get Catholics, but for the most part, Protestants. And each group often had a different view on the natives. So the natives dealing with all these European settlers coming in who all look pretty much the same, are treating them differently based on some nebulous religious idea that the natives don't fully understand. Again, we have other groups like Catholics and Jews who came to escape religious persecution because it wasn't great in Europe for Catholics and Jews. Well, depending on the country. You know, obviously in Spain and France, it was fine. But England and the Germanic states, oftentimes it would be tough to be a Catholic, and the Jews have been given hell since the start. And also, despite how the people from Africa were brought over to North America, and again, I have to emphasize that it was not immigration. It was being kidnapped and brought over via slavery. I don't know why we have people who think they're going to be in politics saying it was immigration, but whatever. Still, they managed to bring over pieces of their culture and oftentimes would stick to these old traditions, even the ones who were allowed to be proselytized to, because, again, there was this whole thing of, like, don't make the slaves Christian because then they'll think they're people. There was some of that allowed, depending on where you were, but even then, they would tend to hold on to their old beliefs, and oftentimes, as we're going to see in a later chapter, they would combine, like, African traditions with religious aspects from the Caribbean, and then combine those two with this version of Christianity they were taught to kind of create their own thing. It was really neat. You often see that, for the most part, in, like, Louisiana, like the Creole culture. That's sort of where that came from. Because it's not just, like, the Native Americans and the Africans, and in the case of Louisiana, the French, but also, like, culture coming in from the Caribbean. So here again we have, you know, the migration of these various groups. Obviously the French and Spanish here towards the middle, and then of course the Spanish down here in Florida. And then mostly English, but you also have a lot of other groups here as well, the Dutch and Swedes, setting up areas along the East Coast. This is the walking purchase, which, I mean, I know compared to, like, all of Pennsylvania doesn't look like a lot, but considering at the time Pennsylvania was like this, was just this corner over here, claiming that all of this was agreed upon by William Penn, which it wasn't, was definitely a major, like, land grab. Oh, I haven't gotten into, sorry, I was getting ahead of myself. We haven't talked about the religious diversity yet. That's the next thing. Yeah, so something, at least I know I was taught about this a bunch due to where I went to school. One of the biggest, like, cultural events of this period was the Great Awakening. So to set that up, because it doesn't just suddenly happen, there's a lot of build-up to that. So lots of concerns, different religions coming to America. The people who were in charge, which is, say, the British Protestant majority, felt like things were going bad because, when you've been in charge for generations, anybody else getting any amount of equality suddenly feels like you're under attack. So this is just kind of the intro for this section, but it's the only place that mentions the New Light Clergy and the Old Light Clergy, and both of those were in bold, so I figured I would include them. New Light Clergy, where these ministers would work together regardless of affiliation. So as long as they were Protestant, you'd have, Baptists and Methodists and Presbyterians and whatever other groups working together to fight back against nebulous concern. Whereas the Old Light Clergy were the more traditional clergy, where they would remain within their denominations because, only their way is the way to do things. By this, Old Light Clergy, rational appeal, educated ministry, established classes, whereas the New Light Clergy appealed more to emotion. Their ministry was typically converted during the Enlightenment, and the people that they typically appealed to were those that were dispossessed, those that were not like established rich colonists, just the everybody else, which we'll get more into in a minute. This is, like I said, just kind of a brief overview. So, one of the things that spurred this along was the Enlightenment. Now, granted, the Enlightenment had happened back in the early and mid 1600s. So as we're getting into the 1700s, the Enlightenment has really spread to most of European holdings. This emphasis on rational and scientific thinking over, tradition and superstition. But the Enlightenment was not anti-religion, just that things we don't necessarily know we could figure out because we're humans and we are good at figuring stuff out. Things like, say, lightning storms, not just, oh, God's pissed and he's doing lightning. It's like, well, what if we figure out how that's happening? So this was sort of a scientific revolution of figuring things out. However, one of the social aspects of this was that Enlightenment thinkers typically were more accepting of various religious denominations, as opposed to our way is the only way and everybody else is going to hell, which, of course, caused concerns for those established religions that wanted to keep things very, very segregated. Now, there's a group here who we only talk about, I think, twice. It's this, and then another time, it may be this semester, it might be until next semester. Like, we barely mention the Pietists, but it's important enough that their train of thought ended up spreading to a lot of other groups. So while the Pietists themselves were a very small Germanic group of Protestants, their ideas of opposing established churches, people following their heart rather than their head when it comes to spiritual matters, this sort of thing was really influencing other groups. So the Presbyterians, Huguenots, Anglicans, Methodists, the larger groups of Christianity that tended to lead the Great Awakening. And besides just these other groups, you've had clergy and laymen both, laymen being those that aren't clergy, the everybody else. They had concerns about the lack of clergy, and that the few colleges in the colonies, which is to say Harvard and the College of William and Mary, because that was all we had at the time, emphasized learned discourse over passion. To be fair, Harvard and the College of William and Mary were seminaries. You went there to become a minister. It wasn't, it wasn't a law school or anything. But really from the Middle Ages on, the clergy was supposed to be like the learned class. They were the only ones who really knew how to read. They were the only ones who really had colleges or anything. And for a lot of the Middle Ages, they were like the centers of education. However, as this spreads more to the middle class, they start not liking not being the only source of information anymore. So we have folks like Theodorus Frelinghuysen, I guess. This is the only time I'm going to use his name because it's that long. And also William Tennant. Their idea on how conversion worked is really what spread the Enlightenment, or not the Enlightenment, the Great Awakening. So they sort of agreed that for someone to convert to Christianity, there was three things. They needed to be convinced of their sinful nature, experience a spiritual rebirth, and then, following this, behave piously to prove that they had converted. Which, again, is something that a lot of Christian denominations today tend to follow. And these two, along with others, led lots of revivals across the colonies, in addition to some other guys we'll talk about here in a minute. And unlike what we had before, where you go into the church and sit and do your thing, most of these revivals were outdoors. You'd have a dude, find some kind of raised platform, or they would build one, and he would just stand and preach to the people, and they would stand around and do their best to hear him, which we'll get into a bit more in a minute as well. But as we're going to see, this also led to a greater diversity in who was there listening. Here you've got, for example, men and women. Gasp. Women are allowed to be standing around outside so they can come and listen to these ministers. You also have, it's less obvious here, I'll show you again in another image, but you have like this fellow here, between his hat and his wig and what he's wearing, and of course the walking stick, he's a bit more upper class. Then you've got folks back here, they just came in off the field, or out of the field, so you had more of a cross-class audience here. And that gets even further as we get further into the revivals. So, George Whitefield, I suppose you could say he was the one who really got the Great Awakening going. He was inspired by John Wesley. John Wesley was the guy who founded Methodism over in England. And he was really one of the leading guys in what will become the Great Awakening. And using the technology of the day, which is to say ships, really shipping lanes, like specific paths that these ships would take, he would better spread this word of the Enlightenment. He went from where he lived in England to North America 7 times over the course of his work. And again, getting from England to North America took like a month by boat. And it wasn't always especially safe, not just because they didn't exactly have radar to know what the weather was doing, but it was very easy to get sick and die on a boat. And he did this 7 times. Now, granted, that means he went back, so that's 14 trips across the Atlantic. That's more than a year just being on a boat. And that's assuming that the trips only took a month, because sometimes it would take longer, depending on what the weather was doing. In 1739 and 1740, he made 350 stops over the course of a year, which again is absurd. It's like 1 a day. Even if we say that's 2 years, which usually when it's 1739, 1740, something like that, it's like the end of 1 year, the beginning of the other, so it's still roughly a year. Either way, this dude was on fire. Sometimes he would draw crowds as large as 20,000 at a time when Boston's population, Boston again being like one of the biggest cities in North America at the time, had a population of about 17,000. So this dude was pulling crowds bigger than most city populations. That's insane. Whitefield, again, like Tennant, was more of a New Light clergy, so he focused less on denomination, more on what the various groups had in common, as opposed to what few things they disagreed about. And as I mentioned, many of the parishioners felt disenfranchised because in the wealthy churches, you had to pay rent to sit near the front. And obviously, most of these people can barely afford to live, much less pay the church to be able to sit near the front of the church. So these huge outdoor revivals were very welcome to these people who felt like the church was not paying them any attention, which is ironically something that the Catholic Church had trouble with, and they had their own little internal reform and had friars who would go in and be more ground level, but it's a pattern. I mean, we talked about that at the very beginning of the semester. History is patterns. New Light clergy brought new people into religion by the thousands, and those who were already Christian were often born again, which is to say their passion for their religion was increased dramatically. So while some did focus on preaching regardless of what the denomination was, because again, they were more alike than they were different, a lot of the preachers would focus on their own denominations and use this fiery speech and idea of like bringing in new people to make their own denominations larger. But regardless of how they did things, the overall result was that religion had a major boost here in the American colonies. Here we have Whitefield, again, just basically up on a box, doing his speech. This image is a bit more clear than the other one, where you've got a massive diversity of people. I mean, granted, they're English, so they're all very white, but you've got this dude over here that looks like he's more upper class. This guy here clearly just got done working, and he's got a beer. But, he's lower class. That's basic labor. He probably unloads ships. Like just grunt work. You've got a young lady here, an old woman over here. There's a dog, which the dog's always important. I mean, this was more than what you typically see in a regular church. Also, as we'll see in the next slide, I believe, a lot of these big revivals would welcome in slaves as well as freed blacks and Native Americans. So there was actually some diversity to some of these, which of course the established churches were none too happy about. Is that all I've got? Yes. So real quick though, now granted this is a smaller number. If we're looking at some of Whitefield's bigger crowds, it's way back here. So how does a preacher in the 1700s standing on a box communicate his message to what's essentially a stadium's worth of people, usually standing out in a field? Because you don't have microphones. They're not using amphitheaters, which amphitheaters were made to actually amplify the sound. How would one dude get his message to this many people? I mean, he'd be yelling, but you can only yell so much for 20,000 people. Exactly. You would have, and I didn't know about this until, well, I was making this years back. So you'd have Whitefield here. Typically, they weren't people around him like this. They were out over here. But he would be giving his speech, and once you got to about the distance where it was hard to hear him, you would have people standing in the crowd, usually also on raised platforms, who would basically repeat what he said for the rest of the crowd. And if it was a really big crowd, you'd have another set of people further out. So it was like a relay system, essentially. And yeah, that's what they had to do because they were dealing with such huge numbers. You had what were essentially human speakers in the crowd to amplify what the main guy was saying, which is a pretty interesting. At least to me, that's a pretty neat system. That's not something I would have thought about. But yeah, once you've got that many people, you can only yell so much, and it's not like you're in a building that's got acoustics and you can work with, the vibrations and echoes to get you going. If you're standing in a field, you're yelling into the space. So yeah, it's just something I like to bring up when we get to that because I just thought it was neat. So obviously this idea of increased religious fervor was very welcome among the ministers in the colonies. Religion had been in decline. We'd seen especially the Salem witch trials, which wasn't a good look. However, one of the main things about this Great Awakening was not just, we don't have enough religion, we need to have more religion. It was, the religion we have isn't good enough. The educated clergy, established norms, were seen as not just inadequate, but sometimes, a lot of the times it was corrupt. So a lot of the fervor behind the Great Awakening was, hey, the old way of doing things is garbage, we need to do something different. And the people who made their living doing the old way of things weren't happy about that. As I mentioned, women, slaves, freed blacks, and natives were often welcomed into the revivals, and not just come in and stand off to the side and listen. but they were encouraged to partake in the Great Awakening. Not quite as much as men, because again, this is 1700s America, but more than they had ever been welcome or allowed to before, which of course upset a lot of people when it came to how things were traditionally done, both in the North and the South. We also have James Davenport, who is one of the most interesting dudes in this group. He was seen as the most radical, or one of the most radical of this period. I'll just read out of the book here. Drawing thousands of colonists to Boston, Boston Common day after day, Davenport declared that the people should drink rat poison rather than listen to corrupt, unconverted clergy. The officials responded, claimed that Davenport's followers were idle or ignorant persons and of the lowest rank. Boston officials finally called a grand jury into session to silence him, quote, on the charge of having said that Boston's ministers were leading the people blindfold to hell. So not just, hey, the old way of doing things kind of sucks, we should do something different. It was, if you listen to the old clergy, you're being led to hell. Which, needless to say, is taken kind of personally by the old style of clergy. Meanwhile, though, Tennant actually went in the other direction. He reunited the New York and Philadelphia Presbyterians because, again, when you had stuff like this, you would actually see a lot of splits in churches, I guess is the best way. I can't think of the word. Anyway, the churches would split based on differences of opinion, and one group would go over here and make their own church, and one group would go over here and make their own church. Tennant actually did the opposite and brought the Presbyterians back together. Eventually, things did die down, but even after that, the religious discourse in North America remained quite passionate, which, especially considering where we are, yeah. Now, that said, while Davenport is the one we're going to focus on in terms of saying wild stuff, there's a newspaper report on James Davenport back here in the book. Let's see. Nothing could be more astonishing than their insolent behavior. Whilst the books were in the flames, they cried out, thus the souls of the authors of those books, those of them that are dead, are risking the flames of hell, and that the fate of those surviving will be the same unless speedy repentance prevented. So, yeah, they did a little book burning. In the back of the chapter, we have this image. This is George Whitefield. The title itself, Dr. Squintum's Exaltation or the Reformation, he apparently had this medical, what's it say? An eye disease that left him cross-eyed. So they called him Dr. Squintum, which is kind of rude. So here we've got, let's see, an imp and fame hovering over either side of his head. The devil rakes some money below the podium. Down there. On the left, Whitefield's followers are seen with a prostitute, while other followers are shown shoving a mother and child and taking food from a poor woman. So yeah, they didn't have a very high opinion of Whitefield. And granted, down here it's a bunch more stuff that describes what's being shown up here. Yeah, it's just like with the Protestant Reformation, the established groups are not happy with any question to their authority. It's just kind of how that works. All right, let's get into this last section. And we still got like 20 minutes. We might be able to go ahead and finish this chapter today. So, all this religious fervor affected the society as a whole. Most settlements were typically run by rich white men, so it was fairly easy to keep them regulated. As the population continued to grow, and the geography especially was different, which I'll get more into later as well, it was harder to maintain control over the colonies, really, is the most simple way to put it. So technically, ultimate authority was, with Parliament and the King. They were the ones that were in charge of the British Empire, and therefore these British colonies would fall under the rule of Parliament. And any royal officials that were appointed by the Parliament and the King technically could veto anything that the local authorities put together. But, again, it's a month from England to North America and then a month back. There was no way to move messages any faster than that. Because when I say it's a month one way and a month back, I don't mean it would take a person that long to get there necessarily. It also takes, like, mail and any kind of messages that long. So if something's happening in the colonies, it would take a month to get it to England to tell them about it. And even if they had a response immediately, it would take another month to get back to North America to put those decisions into place. So by then, whatever was going on might be over. It was very difficult to run things directly. And that said, even if, say, again, the Parliament or whatever authorities in England immediately had an idea or a response, it wasn't always the best one because, London's been a city for several centuries at this point, and over in North America, even the biggest cities like Boston and Jamestown were still pretty much frontier towns. So these suggestions, or really demands, made by London were not necessarily realistic to the situation in North America. And because this is important going forward, the feeling of independence in North America, the various town meetings, representative bodies, the House of Burgesses, for example, had been used for so long that a lot of the colonists weren't real keen on listening to royal officials. So for the most part, with the British, they just assumed, you send in someone who's got a royal stamp and the colonists will listen to what you say because that's what the British have been doing for hundreds of years. And most colonies were under tighter control by Britain. North America was kind of left alone because they weren't really ruling over the natives. We very rarely even got along with the natives, and most of the colonists were just Englishmen. In a place like, say, India, most of the population are Indians, and England has to pay more attention to what's going on there due to the difference in culture and the way the society is run. Over here, it was just like, it's just another England. I mean, they literally, part of the colonies were called New England. It was just more England. So they felt like they didn't need to really pay too much attention to it. But as we've seen, individuals like Roger Williamson and Hutchinson, events like the Salem witch trials and the Stoner Rebellion, and all this stuff going on during the Great Awakening, in particular Davenport, showed that the North American colonists weren't just this real simple, homogeneous group of Englishmen that had come over to another continent and were making another England. Now, granted, all of this, I mean, Roger Williamson and Hutchinson were right there next to each other, but most of this was really spread apart in terms of time and distance. You know, the Stoner Rebellion happened down here in South Carolina. Salem witch trials were way up in Massachusetts. So, you know, this stuff was spread out, but it showed, again, that things were not especially strict and orderly in the colonies. There was a lot of people doing what they wanted to do. But really, in particular, doing things independently from England. So again, here we have the spread of the populations, for the most part, you know, here in the central Atlantic and New England, gradually down here. But you've got these larger population centers where obviously the people are doing their own thing. Which leads us to protests against the colonial elite. Now, granted, the colonial elite are typically just the colonists that are in charge, so they weren't directly rebelling against, say, England, but it was very easy to equate any kind of royal authority with the colonial elites. So just kind of keep that in mind as we go forward. So a common protest was against the price of bread. In the 1730s, for example, the price of bread went up while grain prices dropped, which is weird because you think if grain prices were high, bread would be high. But no, people were making less money growing grain, but they have to pay more money to buy the bread the grain's made out of, or the grain, yeah. Or the bread that is made by the grain. Anyway, regardless, so most people growing wheat are now making less, and one of the few staples in their diet is now more expensive. Most of these protests were led by women because, well, women are usually the ones who are going into town and making these purchases, so they're the ones on the front lines. One of the ways that this was typically done, especially over in Europe, was that the people who were protesting the bread prices would just refuse to accept that the price had gone up. And when you're, say, you're the guy running the bread or the bakery, and these people come storming in demanding that they be able to buy bread for what the price had originally been, usually you just go ahead and agree to them that the price had always been what it was and not to worry about it, because they will tear your shop apart. There was another thing specifically in Massachusetts or Boston where the farmers would come and set up stalls to sell their goods because, again, farmers barely made enough to survive. So in Boston, officials decided that they would charge a fee to set up these stalls, which would mean that the farmers would barely make any money, assuming they sold anything, and if they didn't, they would now be out whatever money they would have made. So this obviously pissed a bunch of people off. They petitioned to the government to change this. The government, of course, listened like they always do, which is to say they ignored them. So one night, all the stalls got destroyed. And weirdly enough, in Boston, which again, one of the most populous cities in North America at the time, nobody saw anything, which is to say everyone was on the side of the farmers, and they wouldn't tell the officials what had happened. This is also something we're going to see going forward. Whoops. Okay. Also, speaking of something we're going to see more of, well, this thing of people working together is going to show up more here as well. So impressment. This is extremely important because not only will we see it this chapter and the next chapter and the following chapter, but even like after the Revolutionary War, there's still this happening. So if you don't know what impressment means, this is what impressment means. Is you're being forced into the Royal Navy. Now granted, this happened all over the English Empire, or the British Empire, because, I mean, Britain constantly needs new sailors for their ships, and they're always at war, particularly with, France. And being on a ship sucked, and it was really easy to die, and a lot of people also deserted. That's how we got the pirates. They were just Royal Navy guys that were like, this job sucks, let's leave. And they did. And again, the conditions in the Royal Navy were so bad that when the royal officials came in to force them into naval work, they resisted. They fought back. And as we're going to see a little bit later on, sometimes it was more than just the dudes getting grabbed. So here we have the bread riots. Bread riots were a common thing in Europe, but, again, European colonies, so same idea. Yeah, it's a good idea to agree that the bread prices hadn't risen. Otherwise, your bakery is going to get messed up. This is, it's, let's see, engraving for the Oxford Magazine, the Press Gang, or English Liberty Displayed. So you've got dudes just getting grabbed and dragged onto the ships. The people doing the grabbing tended to have sticks and clubs, and if you decided to disagree with going with them, they beat the hell out of you. And if they knocked you out, cool, they drag you onto the ship and you'd wake up at sea. Congratulations, you're in the Navy now. Yes, it was very easy to get into the Navy. You often would do it by mistake. So one of the unique things about these protests in North America is that they were often cross-class protests. There were people, there were lower classes that were fighting back, particularly with the impressment. But oftentimes you would get like middle and upper class people protesting as well against royal authorities. So as we get closer to, the big date, this idea of people, working together regardless of class distinction shows up. So there's some political change in New York City. There's some names here that you don't really need to worry about. But basically, the the ability to vote in New York was expanded. As long as you were a man that had property, you were able to vote. It used to be you had to have like a lot of property, but now it was just if you had held land at all, you could vote. So there was an election between Lewis Morris and Governor William Cosby, the latter of which who was the royal official. Morris ended up winning. Great. That's not super important, just that the result was that Peter Singer, who ran the New York Weekly Journal, was not very fond of the royal authority sent over here by England. He accused Cosby of corruption, election fraud, and tyranny. He was then jailed for libel, because back then, libel was if you said anything that undermined authority, whether or not it was true, it was seen as illegal, which technically is like why the First Amendment is what it is. You're allowed to say whatever as long as it's true. But even then, people are rarely like jailed for libel. Although there can still be consequences to things that are said. Andrew Hamilton in Philadelphia, I should say, fought back against this, argued that as long as you're telling the truth, it should be protection against libel. Like if you're libel, by modern definition, is like you're making up spurious claims about someone to the extent that it like causes damages, that it say hurts their business or causes them to be ostracized, and it's completely untrue. That's libel. Back then, libel was just you're talking crap about anybody. You can't do that. So what's important here is that Peter Singer ended up being released from prison because, according to this court case, the truth shouldn't be considered libel. That said, the libel law didn't actually change, but Peter Singer was exonerated. So that's all well and good. Anyway, that's it for the chapter. Religious political awakening, Israeli people. It brought some groups together, but it also split them apart. That's one of the main things about the Great Awakening, is that it actually like split a lot of congregations. That was the word I was trying to remember earlier. While it made people more religious, it also often made them more divided. People saw themselves as being from what country they were from, as opposed to being like English colonists. And at most, they would identify as a resident of whatever colony they were in. There was not this like larger colonial identity yet. That's something that we'll really be fighting about in Chapter 6. So the distinctions between religion, class, and races still remained, and often were made worse by these various movements. So despite the pushback against royal authority, there was still plenty of authority there, because as we saw at the very beginning of the chapter, this idea of control and power was seen as more important than like individual liberty. Anyway, okay, that's it. We'll do chapter 5 on Wednesday.